Hello, this is Crystal Meach with Tao of the Heart. And today I have Cyndi with me from Into the Known. And I'm going to dive in like I always do. Ask Cyndi. So, how did you get started on your spiritual journey?
Thank you, Crystal. And thank you for having me on. I'm very excited. And after having on our podcast, which you should be able to check out the episode, I'm just excited to talk to you and happily share how I got started and where I'm at and any other questions you might have. So I'll like you just dive right in. So I part of me has always been fascinated by spirituality, by occulty things, by what motivates people. In my entire life, all of my educational studies is based off of human motivation. Like, why do people do the things they do? How are people impacted by the world around them? This has been my underlying push since I was very young. And in my early 20s, The Secret came out, the movie, and everybody was talking about it. I had borrowed it from the library. I was living with my grandfather at the time, and my sister was kind of interested in it as well. And at that point, I had met a few people that had done some psychic work and spiritual work, but I hadn't quite found the right spot. And when I watched The Secret, I was a bit like, I don't get it. I didn't get the point. I think even now, if I try to rewatch it, I think that the concept is so simple and it's overcomplicated. And so I think I was very much like, I don't understand this. And I live in Northern California. I had just finished undergrad or was a year or two out of undergrad. And several of my friends from high school that I had reconnected with had gone to a place called the Berkeley Psychic Institute, which is in Berkeley, California. And they do aura readings there. And all of my friends were like, you need to go over there. And it started because I wanted to learn to read tarot cards, honestly, because I thought they could tell the future, which, fun fact, they can't. And so my friends were like, you should maybe just go get a reading. I had this reading where there was a line of, I think, 3 or 4 people and one person standing behind them. And they were telling me things about myself. And this is probably 2007, 2008, things that they had no business knowing, things that probably still aren't on the internet. And I was blown away. But I think what blew me away the most that really pulled me into this was the way in which the sessions are done there. You go for about an hour, you take a break, and then you come back and you get to ask a question. And during that break, you talk to a teacher or the director. And I walked up to the director and he's like, introduces himself and he's like, so who's the young man that follows you around? And I was like, okay. So I lost my boyfriend in college, and it was like, people knew this. Again, social media was not what it is today. So it's not like somebody could have Googled my name and seen oh, this person lost their boyfriend 2 years previously. And I was so taken aback by somebody knowing something about me that had no business knowing. He wasn't in the room when we did the reading. I don't even think Jeremy came up during the reading. And the more we talked, the more validated I felt and the more confused I was. And I still have the email I sent my friends after this. I actually read it once every year or two, where I read my confusion about the reading and being like, I don't know what this was or what that was, and this is what they said. And it just really planted the seed. So I started getting books, and it was a holiday. It was a couple weeks later, maybe a month later. And I think it was Thanksgiving or Christmas. And we're at dinner at my parents' house. And my grandpa says, because I was living with them at the time, your daughter's getting into the occult. And my parents were like, yeah, okay, whatever. Because in my grandfather's defense, I had checked books out from the library. I left them on the dining room table. This speaks to how oblivious I am to how other people perceive me. And after dinner, my dad pulled me aside and he's like, hey, are you serious about this? And I said, yeah, I've had a reading at Berkeley Psychic Institute. I know they start classes in the new year. And he's like, there's a place closer. I've been training there for a year. And I'm like, I'm sorry, what, Dad? You have been doing an intuitive training program for 1 full year. You did not tell any of your children. You told your wife, my mom, who kind of gets it, but doesn't really get it. What? I was so confused. But he introduced me to my meditation center. I started training there, and all these things from my life, knowing things about people, being able to predict behavior to some degree, having information that a child has no business knowing things, all started to make sense when I started training, and I started being taught how to use this skill that was so uncontrolled previously. Once I got into a training program, everything made sense. And I started my program, I paused, I decided to go to grad school, which was a dream of mine since I was a kid. I uprooted, went to the East Coast. There was nobody on the East Coast doing this work in this capacity. And to be clear, this was like, we had Skype, and Skype wasn't even like confidently like reliable. And so there were no classes online. I had to take a break. None of my mentors knew anybody doing anything virtual. And after grad school, I moved back to California and jumped right back in. And it really, my ideology, my modality, it really answers my questions, lets me still be curious, lets me still be sciencey, lets me still have my agency. Like, I'm not surrendering to anything but myself, and gives me a lot of answers and a lot of comfort. And so that's kind of like where it started. And originally I wanted to learn to read cards. That's really what it was. And then it was like, oh, what are past lives? Oh, how do I communicate with my spirit guides? And all these other things that were satiating my curiosities.
So that was
I know, I'm so sorry. I always tell people I will talk if you don't interrupt me.
no, it's all good. So fast forward to today. What is your biggest interest right now?
Gosh, intergenerational studies and the energy of intergenerational studies. So, like looking at boomers to Gen X to millennials to Gen Z to alpha, and like looking, that's my personal fascination. That's where, when I've got downtime and I'm looking at energy, that's what I'm looking at, because it's very impactful to the work that I do. It's very impactful for my clients. Generational information informs our experience, helps us understand our trauma, all those things. So right now, generational stuff.
So are you,
I am a millennial. I'm an elder millennial. All
what
my
does that mean?
siblings. So elder millennials were typically born between 1980 and 1984, and many of us had Gen X siblings. And so a lot of our social and cultural experiences were informed by Gen X, but we're technically millennials. And then we have certain like very universal millennial experiences, but that specific cohort is the most interesting because of the developmental ages for really important things like the introduction of the home computer, the introduction of the internet in everyone's home, the Clinton trials, September 11th, like all these very interesting things happened at developmentally important times for that cohort. And they straddle, or we straddle, Gen X cultural memorabilia, nostalgia, social things. We probably drank from hoses. And then we also straddle, like with millennials, remember what life was like before it, but also it's part of our life, internet, smartphones, etc. So yeah, elder millennial.
So can you give me like an example of like what you're diving into as far as across, like, is there like a certain point in history or I don't know.
Yeah, what a great question. It's more looking at how the energetics of the systems that people lived in informed their experience. And so for millennials in particular, our K-12 experience was all about validation, being a unique snowflake, a participation certificate, I can't even talk, being validated for just simply being alive. It also meant there was a high expectation of people pleasing, a high expectation of performance, productivity, perfection, that as adults, many of us are trying to undo. So oftentimes when I have a client that sits in front of me that is working on their people pleasing tendencies, my starting point, aside from looking at their energetic history and like how that started probably in childhood, is also looking at how it was validated in their K-12 experience, and then how that set like a foundation for jobs that overexpose millennials or overuse them, etc. And I mean, I think you're a millennial. I think we talked about this. I think you're a millennial as well. We are the burnt out generation. We all hit our mid 30s and upward, and we're just like not wanting to do anything, no motivation, no desire to be productive, high levels of burnout. And a lot of it energetically is because of how we were primed when we were younger. So those are the things I look at simultaneously, looking at how the boomers raised millennials and like what the boomer as like a generation, what their history is and what they held and what they were taught socially and emotionally really informed how they parented. And I work with a lot of families as well. So it's like getting to look at all these different like aspects of life that is very like 3D, if not more, and taking that and then understanding how it applies to like a single person's experience. So I like to kind of go in and out of like the big picture, but then also how does it matter to the person that's in front of me?
Yeah, and it's interesting as you were saying that, like you were talking about the millennial, and for me, it was coming up. This sounds very productive. Productive sounds masculine to me
Mm,
compared to connected, which is more feminine.
yeah.
So, are we maybe studying how that is playing out in our life? I guess.
I don't necessarily focus as much on words. I do focus on, is it more of a female or male or masculine or feminine energy to the word itself? And I agree with you. I think productive is. And I would use like manifestation, creativity, connection as like the more feminized versions. I don't spend as much time looking at the gendered aspect solely because I've worked with LGBTQ plus, specifically work with the 17-year-old trans kid for the last 10 years, that like gender, it doesn't get removed because it does exist. Like we do have male energy, we do have female energy, but it's not as interesting to me, I don't think. It's more the power dynamic that gets my attention.
Okay. So, what do you mean by the power dynamic?
So I in grad school spent a lot of time studying Nickelodeon, the network. When we look at Nickelodeon entire first like real generation, like once it established itself as a network, was about emphasizing that power dynamic between the adult and the child and teaching kids that they had agency, they had rights. Nickelodeon came out with the Bill of Rights for Kids, I think in 1991 or 1992. And they really emphasized like the empowerment of children. And they did it by juxtaposing it against adults. Now, that method didn't work for Nickelodeon now that the millennials are the adults. Like, it just, they had to change their tactic, which is great. And like, historically and socially, I'm like obsessed with that. But it started the conversation really young for me about who holds power and like what that looks like. And I had very open parents that my dad, which if you met him, you wouldn't necessarily know this is what he would have encouraged. He was really big that I didn't have to give somebody respect simply because they were older than me. So he would back me up if I talked back to a teacher or an adult if he thought I was in the right. He wouldn't just be like, you're the kid, you have to listen. So it's those power dynamics of like how it informs people's identity, how it informs their agency, their sovereignty. And in contemporary times, because I work with families and like I work at it from a child-centric perspective and like ensuring that the child has a voice. I'm not saying that children should run the show by any means, but that they have a voice in the conversation, breaking down like just because I have more experience or just because I'm older, I therefore have more power. And that is where you do often see gender come in, especially with white male privilege. It does show up energetically. It is part of the conversation, but it's that kind of power of like, who's making decisions? How does it inform someone's identity? Does everybody have the ability to say no to something? That type of stuff. And sometimes with some clients, it's like in the workspace or it's in their personal relationship or their romantic relationship. And there's other like aspects to this as well, like culture. Did you grow up in an individualistic culture like in the US? Did you grow up in a collectivist culture like in most Asian countries or Mexico or Armenia? Like, and how does that also contribute to like those power dynamics? And this is all from an energetic lens, just to be clear. Like, I do know quite a bit of the literature. Obviously, I'm still an academic and scholar at heart, but a lot of this is looking at the energy, and that I find is more supportive to the individual. But if I was like writing a book, obviously I'd like generalize to a whole group.
Wow. Just
I love
thinking
that you didn't know where this was going to go. And I
yeah,
can see like how much you're like, this is not where I thought this is going. And I'm so here for that.
I love it. So, when you're mentioning Nickelodeon, which is fascinating to me, like I didn't grow up with cable. Like I
Mm-hmm.
grew up on a farm. So,
Doesn't mean you
never
weren't
watched
still, I mean, you weren't still
Nickelodeon.
exposed to it in different
Yeah,
ways. And
I
like,
will
doesn't
feel
mean
it.
you didn't know it
Yeah,
existed.
yeah. Um, but what's interesting to me, this isn't necessarily in the mainstream news, like Nickelodeon, the video Justin Bieber and P. Diddy.
Oh, I don't think I've seen that.
Justin Bieber's like, I don't know, 14 years old, and Sean Combs is basically saying, "Hey, I'm I got Justin Bieber for the weekend. I got custody of him for the weekend.
Oh my
And that
gosh, that's
kind of
so
starts,
problematic.
yeah, and that starts the journey, the pedophilia, the child trafficking, all the
Yep.
dirty stuff coming up.
Well, and we had just recently on the Investigation Network, we had the whole, I forget what it's called now. And like, I'll fully disclose, I have not watched it, but it's about Dan Schneider, basically, who is the creator of iCarly, Zoe 101, Victorious. He's always been known to be a bit, I won't call him a pedophile because I don't think there's been charges. I don't think there's been charges against him, but he's run in that circle. And that entire documentary was about the kids that worked with him and how it was impactful. And then later we find out about P. Diddy and like underage people. And so, yeah, it's interesting because the same thing happens on Disney. It's just not talked about because they have more money.
Yeah, I mean, the Disney ties to Epstein were,
Yeah. Yeah. And like Nickelodeon from the beginning has always made an effort to present a more quote unquote real child experience as opposed to Disney, which has always made an effort to create a sensationalized Disney experience, which is on brand for both of them, but also speaks to like where the money comes from and like how it gets used. So yeah, I mean, it's very child entertainment is very problematic, and we have some really great advocates for it, like Christy Romano, who was on Even Stevens. She's a huge advocate. I know a lot of like millennials, like Jodie Sweden, have come out and like been very supportive on changing the entertainment industry for kids. I don't know why we don't listen. I don't know why we don't take these experiences and give them the weight that they actually deserve to change an entire system, because I can see it energetically. It's still there. It's just a matter of like people being able to speak up for it. And so like when I work with kids and families, one of my first conversations is about consent and like what's the conversation you had with your kid. Well, my kid's too young. Your kid is never too young to understand consent. And teaching, like my hope is like if we teach it in the everyday, then it becomes normalized, and then these instances where it's not normal actually can get some of the attention that it needs to change the systems.
yeah, I mean, it's such a huge platform.
It is.
We kind of like took the negative side, but maybe we can swing to the positive side now.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So tell me more about the power dynamics that you're studying related to, what you're finding about millennials. I mean, that's giving them their power back, I guess.
It's interesting because like there's a wide, I work with people, like I work with kids all the way up to people like, I think my oldest client's probably like in their 70s or 80s, but the majority of my clients are Gen X and or millennials. Gen Y is what we were called at one point. With millennials, there's a couple contributing factors that determines it. One is, do they see that they don't have power? Do they feel powerless? And when you give someone that language without using the word power, so when you talk about agency, sovereignty, empowerment, and you start to talk about what the everyday experiences look like with, say, their boss and how micro adjustments can help them feel more empowered, I find that's really helpful. Or like literally just describing the relationship, being like, yeah, it looks like this person micromanages you, or this person's in control, or they require you to take on their perspective for everything. In general, I feel like it falls under one of the camps is the no contact camp, which is a lot of my clients. This tends to be a little bit more Gen X, will go no contact with their families because of the way in which they're not respected, or that power dynamic is still trying to be employed from when they were 4 years old, or they just don't find value in those relationships. I don't know in that camp if you can regain your power if you don't do the work still, if you don't do therapy, if you don't do energy work, if you don't do personal development work of some sort. With millennials, I think it's much more nuanced and it's much smaller because we are the people pleasing generation. And so we want to make everyone happy and we want to keep everyone happy. So we will compromise a lot to keep that status quo. And I think for a lot of millennials, it's a little bit more about where can I feel the power, or where can I feel empowered? And I think for those, they are doing the work. And that's why it's like much more nuanced and like less substantial seeing. And even talking with people over the last few days that don't do any of this work, but like hearing their stories, because I was traveling and I was hanging out with my best friend and all of her friends, it's interesting to see the conversations they're willing to have now that they weren't willing to have, or the acknowledgement. So I think it starts with the acknowledgement that there's some sort of imbalance here in this relationship, whether it's with family or with like your professional space. And then from there, like determining how you want it to look. I think the most interesting part for me is the millennial parent and how they approach children and childhood and how they view power. Because in a child centric home, it's my perspective that the child's voice should be not of equal always to the adult, but it should be heard. It should be part of the conversation. And that with gentle parenting, when employed correctly, gentle parenting is not permissive parenting. It teaches kids that they're not equals to their parents, but they have a voice. They have the ability to be heard, to create change. And so I feel like for millennials, if we don't feel like we can change it in our lives, we're trying to change it in the next generation's life. And like with the kids that I work with, that is a big part of like working with the family. And when I take on new families, part of the conversation is like, what's your comfort level with me teaching your child to have their voice? Because if you're not comfortable with that, I'm not the right practitioner, because ultimately my goal is to teach every kid that they have a voice and that they have agency and sovereignty. And no, I don't think that your 14-year-old child should be yelling at you in any way, shape, or form. That's not what I'm saying. But they're in pain. They need to be heard. So a lot of different ways. I don't think there's a universal way for millennials, whereas like Gen X, I think just kind of says like, we'll just go no contact because it's easier.
It's fascinating. I'm just thinking of like my own experience, like, like when I started doing occult work and really diving in, like I kept it very hidden.
Hmm?
And even now, like me showing up, it's kind of like my relationships are, like they don't feel like it's that I have integrity as I start to, becoming genuine to myself. So it's first learning about the self betrayal and then, coming out to that,
Yeah.
who I am.
Is that a product of like the community and like geography of where you live? Because obviously, like I'm in California, and so like nothing that I'm sharing right now is like unheard of. But also, like if you know me, like that's just my nature. But so is it partly just geography and environment?
It could be. I mean, I grew up with in a Christian family and, there were those values and
Yep.
do what you're
Yep.
told.
Do's you're told, not as I do, be seen but not heard.
Yep.
Yeah. Which I do stand by boomers. I, in general, don't think boomers were malicious, didn't have malicious intent as parents for the average boomer. I think it was how they were a product of how they were raised. And I think millennials are a product of how they were raised. I just think millennials are pushing back a whole lot more. And I think that's also partly access to like the world at our fingertips at any time and when that access was introduced. So but
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, I could imagine it would be very hard to feel in integrity in relationships when there's this part of you that you don't get to share with people.
Yeah, and then like what's coming up now is like how this environment and then how I took it on as a consent to build the construct of the ego of what is safe.
Mm-hmm.
And then like having the compassion for that piece. Because I think that's when you really start to, I don't know, like the relationship that was maybe severed, you get stronger in that now I have the self relationship that I'm not going to betray myself, but also how do I connect that then with my family?
Yeah. And I think the thing I tell clients all the time, and this was also just like a conversation with people that don't do any spiritual work, their relationships we're always going to compromise ourselves for because it's a family member that we care deeply about and we just know they can't have who we are. Or in the case of a conversation I had, this individual I have a trauma bond with, and I'm not willing to give that up. This person was there during a very traumatic experience that still forever will be part of my life. And while our relationship is really challenging in that she doesn't see who I am in present time or can't accept that, I recognize that I would rather give the space that she not see me and have that relationship. In other words, compromise who I am for her in those instances versus lose that relationship. And I think that's like a hard thing because I know I get a I'll be PG. I get a lot of crap from people because I'm willing to do that. And they're like, but how can you do that if you do all this energy work and spirituality and development? And I'm like, because I'm still human. I'm still a human. I still have human experience and I still have my biases and I still have the places I am not perfect. And I don't want to be perfect because it's boring. Like it's very boring. So I can imagine, I see that struggle in people all the time of like, how do you show up as you? How do you be authentic? And then how do you maintain these relationships where people can't have certain parts of you or just completely disagree and tell you you're wrong, which I think is very hard.
Yeah, it's very hard. And it just, I guess for me, it motivates me to just keep going. Like, I can't stop at this point. So that relationship, I always feel like the more that I do the healing, the more that relationship is going to at some point come to peace.
Yeah. And I know for me, like with my family of origin, I am comfortable with where all those relationships are and not, I think only like two individuals like see me in present time, accept who I am and don't hold me to like a different version of self. And it's hard. It's very hard. And that I love that you go back into your relationship with self to make sure you're honoring where you are.
Yeah, because I think the millennial is really, they kind of lost that because they were busy pleasing everyone else.
Because we were putting everybody else's needs before our own and we were doing what we thought we were supposed to do. And there's nothing like, this is what I always
Nothing
remind
wrong with
people,
that.
like, there's nothing wrong with it. We didn't know there's a different way. And when
Mhm.
we discover there's a different way, that's when your choice comes in. And if you choose to stick the path, then like, fine, that's you. You made a choice. But if you decide to create some shifts and change, then that's like all the better. You get to expand more. You get to be more of you, have more capacity, which I think is beautiful.
Yeah, and it's just so interesting how, like, for me, the study of the occult was about, I did a lot of Neville Goddard's work. So it
Mm-hmm.
was all about going within and really understanding how, I don't even know how to articulate it, how you really.
I still, even since our last conversation, the most I've done is message my mentor and be like, Neville Goddard, Akashic Records, like what? And she's like, yeah, okay. Haven't done my deep dive. But it's interesting that you talk about going within because I feel like one, most people that start their spiritual journey, they go outside themselves. They're looking for something outside themselves to tell them I'm on the right path. I did. I went outside myself. I had to, otherwise I wouldn't have found the. And I would say like now after 15 plus years of like doing this specific modality, having a lot of exposure to different communities, understanding universal law, which I think we might have talked a little bit about on our podcast, on my podcast. I find myself not going within, but going to the corner of the room. And what I mean by that is like looking at the bird's eye view of the totality of my life to see the patterns and connections across the board, like across relationships, across my different spheres of life. And so can't do that if I go within. I have to do it like outside of myself, but it's not inviting in other people's perspectives. It's just where I put my attention to view something that's bigger. Does that make sense?
So I guess my question is, so how does that affect the present moment?
So I do that when I'm trying to like problem solve or understand a pattern or something of that nature. I think the present moment is really hard for us to really be connected to in a world where we are constantly moving from one thing to the next. And I think a lot of us seek spirituality because we want that slowness or that perceived slowness. And I just have to say, the deeper I get into spirituality, the more I feel like there's just more to explore. I try, like in this particular interview, I'm working really hard to be present, to hear what you're saying, to not notice the hundreds of energies that like also want attention, to ignore my phone. And I'm capable. I'm capable. I mean, when I do sessions with clients, my eyes are closed for a reason and it's all about focus. But if I'm trying to problem solve or I'm trying to understand something, I can't be in the present moment. I just can't because I have to understand what came before and like how that's going to impact what's coming in front of me. Yeah. And that's like, I think it's like the equivalent of like daydreaming in school where like you kind of just zone out for a bit and you're like, considering something and then you come back into the present moment. But it's like very much like a mind exercise and spirit exercise, not a body exercise, because the body's always in the present moment. So it doesn't get to time travel yet. Maybe someday.
Do you think it's kind of like women too? Like the mice in the brain?
I do, because female energy, it just vibrates higher, and it just traditionally has a higher capacity. And so I think we do more at once. And I was doing the dishes before we jumped on here, and my brain was thinking about like the things I had to do before we got on, and then also just like mentally reviewing the conversation we had a few weeks ago, and was there anything that like we talked about that I want to make sure, so yeah, I do think part of it is being in a female body. I do.
Wow, that's fascinating.
Yeah. Now, all of
I
that's
didn't
to
think.
say, like, I know men that are equally ruminating on 100 things at once. And I know transgendered individuals that were assigned female at birth that have zero issue in like hyper fixating on something. But yeah, I do. I do think it has to do with the female body.
I just wanted to note that I didn't have anything prepared for this video, for this interview.
So here's the really cool thing. Like, so I think I even put this like in the prep email. Like, I can talk about these 5 topics without interruption for any extended period of time. So there's no need. Like in my head, there's no need. I also improv 90% of my life, which makes me really good at what I do and really bad at being a professor. Good at being a professor in the sense of like, if I'm giving a lecture, and I'm not a professor at present time, but like if I choose to adjunct, if I'm giving a lecture, I can easily pull in like stuff from that day. Like, oh, there was a headline. Oh, I read a snippet. I can like incorporate that. Bad as a professor, because it means like my forethought of like assignments is usually like really challenging, and I change my mind a lot. Also great for the rest of my life. Like, oh, today I planned on doing this and I changed my mind and instead I want to do that, and that's always great. But like, improving should not be people's like main way of functioning in life, and that is 100% my main way.
I agree. This is my creative outlet.
Exactly. Which means you get to just improv it.
If you saw my calendar, you'd be like, you'd see that
Say
I
I'm good
plan.
with calendars. I'm good with calendars. I'm good at that piece of it, but I'm not good at the planning piece. Like, so if we have like a collaborative, okay, we're going to talk about this on Thursday and the topic's elephants, I'm not doing my research till Thursday. Like, I'm going to be real honest with people. So writing a dissertation for a doctoral program was one of the most challenging endeavors I've ever taken, because you can't just sprint it. You have to marathon it. You can't just like be like, all right, I'm writing it all in one day. I mean, I think there are some people that do, but like I was not able to.
Aren't you like so fascinated by those people that have like a plan, like a 20-year plan? Like I know like a lot of wealth advisors, and I was an accountant, so I for 18 years. And they have like a 20-year plan for, and I'm like, well, what, the pandemic, for example.
You didn't know. I mean, I think a lot of us energy
Their
workers knew
plan is
something was coming, but like we didn't know what it was.
yeah.
I struggle with beyond 3 months. I really do. And running 2 businesses makes that really challenging, because you want to have like your forecast, and you want to know your plan, your marketing plan, and your social engagement and your courses. And I think it's really, really challenging for me, like mentally really challenging, because I change my mind a lot and I get bored really easily. So if I say I want to teach the court cards in tarot and it's July and I want to teach that in September, I'm probably already done with it by the time I get to September. Again, makes planning very challenging. 20 years, I can't. That is like, we were reflecting on this friendship of 23 years, and I remember the day she and I met. I remember, or no, longer than 23 years. No, 23 years. I remember the day that we met. I have all these micro moments, but if I were to have guessed, I would have never said that it was a 20-year friendship. So the thought of thinking 20 years into the future just breaks my brain.
Yeah, and when you said 3 months, I was like, yeah, that's kind of what I do. I have a 3-month chunk,
Yeah.
and it's outlined. It's in pencil.
Yeah. And it doesn't mean like there aren't things in that 6-month picture, but like anything beyond a year is honestly very challenging. I think it's always been challenging for me. Like big moves and stuff, or changing jobs, always a challenge.
It feels like you're backing into what your creation rather than creating in the moment.
Yeah. And growing up as a people pleaser, it doesn't leave a lot of space to change your mind, Because like one of the aspects I see as a people pleaser is the rigidity, loyalty, and like reliance that other people have on you. And if you do change your mind, it can get really challenging to communicate that with others because you want to make everyone happy. So
Yeah, that's interesting when you say that, because what triggered me was like in my relationships, people are always like, you don't have the emotional attachment. And I'm like, what do you mean? I'm committed to you right now.
in other words, you're really good at manifesting because you're not emotionally attaching to an outcome. So things just keep happening for you. But then people are like, why are you not more emotionally invested? Because you have disappointment, rejection, bad experiences. You changed your mind. You liked something yesterday. You don't like it today. When I work with kids, they get so frustrated because I'm always like, what's your favorite color today? I told you yesterday it was orange. It's still orange, but you can change your mind. Like, maybe tomorrow it's going to be purple, okay? Someday it's going to be purple. But in relationships, I mean, if that's not part of the vernacular in that relationship, it's really, really hard. My friends all know I reserve the right to change my mind. So, like, we may have the best of plans, and unless it is like a paid experience, there's a 50% chance I'm backing out at the last minute. And you either understand that I have social anxiety and anxiety rode my life for 35 plus years, and it's only been in the last 6 years that like I've learned how to work with it, or you just don't invite me to things. Like, I'm really big on if you need an answer right now, the answer is no. If you can wait, the answer's maybe, which also a lot of it for me, like whether it's energetic and spirituality or like lived experience, is just recognizing that we're human and what sounded good on one day may not sound good on another day. And yes, we still need to honor our commitments. You still need to show up to the interview. You still need to show up to the client session. But some of like the more social, I feel like we get so boxed in and then all we're thinking about is like how soon till we leave this experience and then we're out of the present moment. And the way I describe it to people is like, you don't want me around if I don't want to be there. Trust me, I will make everybody miserable because you forced me to do something. And people don't believe me. And then I show up and I make everybody miserable and they're like, got it. We won't force you next time. And this has been since I was a kid. So like, I'm the friend that doesn't show up to ritualized events like bridal showers or baby showers. You have to tell me very explicitly it's important that I go to these things, including weddings of like best friends, because I don't like it. And energetically, I find them incredibly draining because we're all trying to work towards this like beautiful, perfect idea. Nobody actually wants it. Half the time, the people that are putting the thing together are the ones that want the outcome. And the person that's like supposed to be celebrated couldn't care less that they're there. And I don't enjoy any of it. And energetically, it gets very draining. And so I just don't go. I piss off a lot of people.
What's another thing? Like, do you find that you're like pissed off? Like other people are pissed off when you don't have everything planned out?
No, because I think I'm more of a planner than I'm willing to admit. So if I'm working on with a client and we're in some sort of container, like let's say like you were like, hey, Sin, I want to do a 3-month container with you. I want to work on my mother wound because that seemed a little relevant recently. And I'm like, okay, cool. Part of our intake conversation is here's my plan, but also understand that I'm reading everything in present time. And so if I planned that our third session together, we're looking at the relationship between your mom and your grandma, and we get on that third call and you just had a complete breakdown with a partner, I'm not going to focus on like what we originally said. I'm going to focus on what's in the moment. And from a social perspective, a lot of people, I mean, I'm also like really blessed that the majority of people around me do energy work. So like we all kind of are on the same page, but a lot of people understand I like to leave that buffer room in for like day of insight. And so if we're jumping in the car and we're going down the coast and we're just going to explore what comes forward, and I suddenly decide instead of south, we're going north, like people are usually fine with it. I think people get mad if I don't show up to something that is like a paid experience. And at the end of the day, I'm like, if it was my money, then you don't get to be mad. Like, I'm sorry, you just don't get to be mad. But if it was like you were taking all your friends out to high tea and I at the last minute like didn't show up and didn't have a good reason, just didn't feel like doing it. And in my head, I'm like, that's a justifiable reason. And as a recovering people pleaser, I don't qualify the reasons I don't do things anymore. Then you have a right to be mad, in my opinion. And like, I understand why you're mad. And at the same time, I'm still doing what I think is in my best interest. A lot of people think I'm an only child because of my entitlement, but I'm not. I'm actually the youngest of like 5. But it oftentimes reframe that entitlement to like deep awareness of how I impact the world around me. And then people kind of stop telling me I'm entitled.
Yeah. Oh, that's fascinating. That makes me think of like the invisible contracts. I don't know what those are called.
Spiritual agreements, like karmic agreements, energetic agreements, soul to soul agreements. Those are all the words I would use. I love invisible contracts though. That's so nuanced and telling.
Well, exactly. Where, like you think, like I think of like passive aggressive. When someone's
Mm.
passive aggressive, like they want you to behave one way, but they're letting you know.
Very similar with like narcissistic energy. Not necessarily the diagnosis, we're not diagnosing anyone, but like narcissistic energy can be like that too. The greatest lesson I was taught by one of my teachers, and I wish I would have learned it before grad school, but it was after, was learning how to respond to the words that somebody says versus the picture that they're showing you. And it's that you're telling me this, but I see that you're actually asking for this information. And it's a hard lesson if you're so used to responding to the energy and not responding to the words because you don't understand why people constantly get annoyed with you. When you start to shift it and just respond to the words, the people that were validated by the energetic responses get very frustrated because you're no longer doing what you were doing for them previously. It's a To me, it's a valuable lesson. And then there are times where like responding to that energetic picture is like absolutely what needs to happen because I'm in an interview or it's a safety measure. That person is telling me they're fine and I can see like they're in a deep level of pain. And I just oftentimes am like, you can just also say you don't want to talk about it, but like, please don't lie to me because lying to a psychic is very problematic because we usually know the lie and we're not going to call you out on it just in case anyone's wondering unless like I see that you're in deep pain, in which case I'm going to offer you different language. And I do piss people off with that as well. I think I make people like unintentionally uncomfortable. Sometimes it is intentional and I'm perceiving it as being like annoyed with me. I don't think it's necessarily always annoyance. I think it's just if you have somebody that is that emotionally aware with language, it can be really challenging because I want people to use their words. I don't want people to be passive aggressive. I don't want people to just shut down. I want people to know that they can say, I don't want to talk about that. And most of us are not taught that. And so that's another place that I think I annoy people.
Yeah, I'm just thinking of like well, there's so much here. I can just unpack all that. Well, the first thing I was thinking of was the law, like the study of law, like when you
Mm-hmm.
really get into law, like when you're in the court
Yeah.
and how, feelings are just thrown out the window because it is
Mm-hmm.
based on the word. And what a lesson that is.
Yeah.
And then also I was thinking of like little kids when you were just saying that, like them learning to use their words. That's like one of the biggest things because, we come into this world and we can't use our words until we're, like one or two.
And even then, it's hard. Like, I had a call this morning with a client, and she has an 18-month-old, and she was saying how annoyed her kid seems to be in a baby body. And I was like, yeah, doesn't want to be in a baby body, wants all access to all the tools. And oftentimes it's because of communication. Not the first kid I've seen, not the first tiny human I've seen that is annoyed that they can't express themselves. I work with a now 7-year-old who a big part of what we do together is accessing and expressing and putting language to her emotions and teaching her the range, and it's not all good or bad. And just because you're feeling that way doesn't make you that way. So there's a lot to it, and we don't know how to express it, especially millennials. We were told to shove it down and ignore it. Maybe not as much as like our Gen X brethren, but we were definitely not encouraged to express our emotions. And it was usually like if they were expressed, it was a bad thing. It was a timeout, a go to your room, not a there's something imbalanced here and this person needs some support. It was much more like this is a bit of a nuisance. And so I think there's a change occurring in parenting as well and in society in general of trying to better create space. And then I do think we could go too far with it, right? If everyone is a special snowflake, then no one is a special snowflake. And I think there's a middle ground there that hopefully we'll achieve, or like we'll have a new problem, one or the other. Like when like everyone will figure out the emotional thing and suddenly we won't be able to do, something tactile or silly like that.
Yeah. And just thinking about that, I'm thinking about like across generations, like if you looked at auras, how would they
Yeah.
be different energetics? I mean, that's kind of your whole world, right?
It is my whole world, and I don't think I've ever like looked at the aura of the generations.
Like, is the throat chakra shut down in most millennials?
I would say the second chakra is blown open, which is where a lot of us heal from, which is a little bit below your belly button. I think the throat chakra, yeah, maybe it is more closed down. I would say it is definitely closed down for boomers because they were really not allowed to voice things. And I would say it's very open for Gen Xers. I think the other place that's probably pretty open for millennials would be the sixth chakra and like their imagination space. And I would say more than the throat chakra, the heart chakra is shut down for millennials. I mean, across the board from elder millennials at 1980 all the way to like the youngest crossovers of like 1995. I think you see a lot of inability to create that heart to heart connection.
Fascinating. Well, we could go forever.
We could. Oh my gosh. I
We're
told you I
already,
could talk about anything.
I know, we're 48 minutes in. I think I'm gonna, I would love to have you on again.
I would love to come back, talk about anything.
Yeah, blow each other's minds.
Exactly.
So I'm going to end it there. Check out Cyndi. We'll put her information in the description box below. Check out her podcast with my previous guest, Lisa Sicoli. And yeah, thank you so much for coming on, Cyndi.
Thank you so much for having me, Crystal, and I look forward to coming back and we'll pick a different topic, I'm sure.
Yeah. Have a great day, everybody.
Bye.